welcome to Beyond the Limits. It's Mike here. Matt's here too.
Hello.
Now, we often talk on the podcast about individual breakthroughs or the pursuit of bettering oneself, whether that's through evidence-based means or something completely different. But in our first high performance special, today we're going to look at how entire teams or organizations can consistently perform at their best and push boundaries.
Yes, thanks, Mike. We would like to welcome Dr. Robert Lloyd. Dr. Lloyd is an emergency medicine consultant in East London. He's also a passionate blogger, and you can visit his Substack, which is Dr. Robert Lloyd. Welcome to the show, Robbie.
Thanks very much for having me.
So, Robbie, as we alluded to in the intro there, you're really passionate about high performance and bettering knowledge, and I guess particularly in your medical organization, but I know a lot of this is transferable to non-medical situations as well. How did this come about? How is this a passion project for you?
I think I've been quite interested in performance for quite a few years. You can track it all the way back to 2015 when I went and worked in South Africa as an emergency medicine doctor, and I had a very humbling experience where I couldn't locate my performance in a high pressure environment. Freaked out, did my job badly, and then decided to try and be better at my job over there. And that's kind of continued for years. I've just been interested in how do I, as an individual, get better at my job. And I think that as I've got more experience and now I'm a consultant in my specialty, that has broadened out into how do organizations get better. I've been on a journey for the last 3 years, which I'll detail for you today.
For those listeners who don't know what you're up to in South Africa, then why was this a particularly stressful time?
Yeah, so I wanted to be an emergency medicine doctor. I wanted to deal with the sick patients, the acutely unwell patients. And so I remember being told by a friend of mine, if you really want to cut your teeth in emergencies, you should go and work in South Africa. And I ended up a few months later arriving in this tiny little township hospital called Khayelitsha. And I really did not anticipate the extraordinarily high level of trauma that hospital sees on a daily basis. Young people coming in nearly dead because of being the recipient of just horrendous injuries in this very violent township. And I kind of went into it very naively. I didn't do my homework, and I arrived totally unprepared for this onslaught of extreme trauma, and I just couldn't do my job. I remember freezing in the moment, unable to make any decisions, total paralysis of thought. I was freaking out. I mean, I think if you took my pulse, it probably would have been 160. I was just totally over heightened. That dissipated with time. I managed to kind of get a bit better shift by shift, but I was over there for 4 months, and by the end I was still really nervous going to work. But I just found that whole experience, when I reflected on it, fascinating. Like, what the hell happened to my brain and to my body? By that stage, I was a reasonably experienced doctor. Like, I'd already had a few years on the clock, and I was awful. I didn't know what I was doing, and I couldn't help the patients. I couldn't help my team. And yeah, I ended up thinking a lot about it, blogging a lot about it, ended up talking quite a lot about it. I did this talk called My Mental Toughness Manifesto years ago. The majority of that half-an-hour talk was talking about my freak out, particularly on the first shift where I just melted. But I also talk about some of the things that I ended up doing to try and get myself out of that hole. So yeah, I mean, I won't talk too much about that. I know you want to talk about other stuff, but yeah, that's I think that was the thing that got me interested in performance. Like, how do you get better at your job? How do you do your job well? How do you do anything well? And it's kind of been a narrative of my career since.
It's really interesting to hear you reflect on that. I've listened to that particular talk, which I'd thoroughly recommend, and we'll put a link in the show notes at the end. But I certainly relate to those experiences of being in a situation where I should know what I'm doing, and you think, I'm an imposter here. Is that classic imposter syndrome? And I would imagine that most of our listeners, whatever realm of work they work in, will have potentially felt like this at some stage as well. I guess it's how you come back from that, or how you address that, and that's really important. And what we want to particularly talk about today is a blog post that you wrote called Culture and Machines. I know you talk about your time working in helicopter emergency medicine in Sydney, and again, that imposter syndrome, but also about how then you can get something palpable out of this and actually better yourself.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I went and worked for an organization called Sydney HEMS, or New South Wales Ambulance, in 2022. And there's quite a lot of parallel with the experience in South Africa, actually. It was a job that, unlike South Africa, I had earmarked for years. Like, I wanted to do that job for ages. The idea of flying around in a helicopter over Sydney obviously is cool, but actually more than that, well, there's some people that do work in that organization that are role models of mine, and I'd sort of followed for years online, and they'd had a huge influence on my career. And so, yeah, I wanted to do that job so badly. And so when I got the gig, it was a big deal. And, you know, and therefore I was kind of heightened for that reason. I arrived over there, I took my little family with me, and we shipped ourselves over there as soon as I finished my last day working my other job, and gave ourselves no time to find a place to live. I remember like staying in this Airbnb in the middle of nowhere and just suddenly arriving in this huge induction. Yeah. And I was just like extremely nervous again. There wasn't the same drama as there was in South Africa, obviously, but that same feeling exactly as you described, of being a bit of an imposter. What happens over in Sydney, and it happens in most HEM services, they tend to see the highest acuity patients. So lots of really severe major trauma, but also lots of critical care, into hospital transfers, so really sick people. The process that you go through when you arrive as a new starter in a HEM service is you go through a very intense induction. So in Sydney, it's a month long, and it's not lectures. I don't like lectures, and there weren't any, which is great. It's just lots of workshopping, lots of drilling, lots and lots of simulation training. And those sims that we were doing were in front of an audience of people who had clipboards and taking notes about your performance. Like, it was really intense and, you know, unbelievable training, no doubt about it. Like, the processes that you absorb into your bloodstream doing that, it's just phenomenal. And you also do some of the aviation stuff, because you need to learn how to be in a helicopter and not be an idiot. You're learning a lot of new things. And the idea is that you finish that month of training, and then you kind of go out as a ride along. They called them ride alongs over there, for 3 shifts. So you go out with one of the established members of the service, and you go and, you know, you go and see some actual patients and do the job that you've now been trained to do. But in a HEM service, you often just shoot blanks. You don't see any patients. And so 2 of those 3 shifts, I didn't see anybody. I was just on base, waiting for the phone to go off, and nothing happened. And so I felt at the end of this process completely not mission ready. My imposter syndrome remained despite this intensive training. And then something came to my rescue. And that is this process that they do over in Sydney HEMS called coffee in cases. And coffee in cases now is very much a part of me. I am all about this process. Like, it's had such a huge impact on the way that I practice medicine, that I problem solve, the way that I approach my whole life. It's just become this huge thing for me. And yeah, excited to talk about it with you guys.
Hearing you regale some of those horrifying scenarios of heightened stress and anxiety certainly brought back specific memories of mine that I've definitely shared with Mike when we were in Australia looking after poorly patients that we felt underqualified or underprepared to. And I remember telling you, Mike, I remember saying how I felt like just running into the sea and just like escaping, and the total stress and panic just caused me to completely discombobulate.
A number of times I woke up at sort of 5 a.m. in the morning when you were on a night shift, and I just had a message from you just saying, I want to run to the sea.
But there's certain characters who obviously find ways of dealing with that. And you've clearly found a way of not only dealing with that, but maybe trying to adapt to it and to learn and to improve. And I guess that's the whole kind of remit of this talk, and about your research and your publications. I want to just start back to how you figured out this process, because you mentioned quite nicely earlier that you hate lectures and that a lot of this learning that you did was experiential. Just break it down, because I know that you've understood now that learning has kind of different meanings, and there's different approaches to understanding things. Can you just give us a bit of a framework?
I obviously can't comment on other industries because I've only ever worked in medicine, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was similarities elsewhere. I think that a lot of the time in medical education, medical school, and in postgraduate training, I think there is a lot of time that is devoted to learning. And I think that's great. I mean, for example, in most departments that I've trained in my emergency medicine training, there was like multiple hours a week, often daily, put aside for small group teaching or lectures. And I think that too much of the time the dynamic in the room is that there is a person who is the teacher and there are the learners listening to the teacher. That teacher will often have a PowerPoint, and we sit in a room. That person in general will be speaking about their own experience or their own research, or they'll be talking about something abstract which they have an interest in. And the dynamic will be that you as a learner should be absorbing that knowledge. And I just think that's all wrong. I just don't think it works. It certainly doesn't work for me. It doesn't penetrate my consciousness. I feel that a lot of the knowledge acquisition I've done solo until recently, when I realized actually it's the opposite of that. That's the most effective way of doing it, and that's socializing knowledge. And that's what Coffee and Cases is. It's socializing knowledge. It's sitting down and talking shop and not having a leader.
Why did that work for you, and what did that actually practically involve?
Well, it's probably a good idea to tell you what Coffee and Cases is. So in Sydney, there was up to 10 people around pretty much every day. And without fail, every single day at 10 a.m., people would sit down, have an espresso from the really nice espresso machine in the room next door. And people would just talk about the job, talk about recent cases. And there was no pre-plan to that discussion. There certainly wasn't anybody with a PowerPoint. It was just a group of clinicians of varying experience levels. So some new starters, some people had been there 20 years, but people just sitting down in a very collegiate, very informal way and talking shop. And the conversations had absolutely no rules. So yes, it could start off with a case discussion about a real case that might have happened the previous day, but invariably it would be tangential, and you would go down rabbit holes or bring in cases that had happened 4 years ago, and there was just no rules to it. And that happened every day without fail, including Christmas Day. It was just a rhythm that happened, a ritual. And if you think about me specifically in that moment when I first started doing it, I was nervous. I was lacking confidence. I had lots of questions, and I don't know what you guys are probably familiar in with the feeling of not knowing whether you should ask a question, that fear of looking like a moron. And I started off thinking like, oh, God, I'd love to be able to ask that really stupid question, because it will just make me feel like I'm not going to make a fool of myself when I'm on the helicopter tomorrow. But what quickly happened is I realized I could ask those questions. There just wasn't any judgment at all. And there was this kind of keenness among the group for people to surface whatever they were feeling. So yeah, there was so many little bits to it that just led to me being able to explore the job in a way that I hadn't been able to do in any other educational forum that I'd experienced.
Reading your blog, I found the concept of this open vulnerability very powerful. This feeling as though however senior someone was, they weren't afraid to admit mistakes or admit times that they hadn't got things right, purely from a kind of educational and a learning point of view. I was wondering, what's the biggest misconception people have about putting that into practice? Is it because it's seen as a weakness, or do you think there are cases where it ever can backfire, and how would you prevent that?
That's a good question. If it could ever backfire. Yeah, I think the reason people don't like talking about cock-ups is because there's a fear of it making them look incompetent, and I've had that fear for years. I think it's a natural human thing. Whatever the scenario, whether it's professional, social, even at home, you kind of want to present your own self in the best way. So yeah, the idea of talking about stuff that you as an individual have failed at feels uncomfortable and unnatural. But what I realized, and I did actually feel like this in South Africa as well, again, there really is a parallel, I think. But if you're able to front up with colleagues who can help you about stuff that you have done wrong or failed at or feel insecure about, it just opens up a new world. Like, it immediately changes the conversation. I've treated it like a weapon. You can sharpen your sword, if you like you can really get to the nub of what you need as an individual to get good. If you say, this is the thing I did wrong, this is the precise thing I feel like I did wrong in this case or in this decision-making process or this procedure, you're going to get somebody to say, this is how you do it right. This is the thing that you need to tweak to get yourself to the next level. If you don't say anything, it's a missed opportunity. It's taken me years to get to that secret. So I now, just as a consultant, I just talk about cock-ups all the time because it just lights up the room. In Sydney, I remember some of these guys who are literally heroes of mine, people that I just loved, and just hearing them talk about absolute howlers stuff that I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that. But then following that admission, it was conversation that just crackled with energy. And everybody felt like they could just chime in and just get involved in that educational frenzy. It just does something to an educational environment. If you have somebody who's got credibility and they're willing to be vulnerable, they're willing to talk about their own failures, it's like turbocharging the room. And so yeah, as I say, I use it as a weapon now.
Vulnerability is an interesting one, isn't it? I feel like we're in, Hollywood, we're force fed all these kind of strong guys, these strong characters, and how it's almost seen as optimum to be invincible, and just be the one who gets it right all the time. But I am just so drawn to people who show vulnerability, and it's so much more genuine, isn't it? I definitely, pretend and will keep quiet if I'm worried I'm going to say something stupid, much like I do on this podcast, which is probably why Mike's doing most of the talking all the time. But I feel like it's a really powerful trait. Like you said, you described it as a weapon or sharpening your sword. I feel like to get to where you are now, like you said, you're at the top of the tree. You're a consultant in an emergency department. You have, a wealth of experience that you can rely upon to show that vulnerability. And I'm curious if you try and instill this trait into your very junior members of the team, and if so, is that important in their learning? Is it something you try and instill in them?
I think it's quite easy in many ways to have this mantra when you're in a position of seniority. When you're senior, it feels like a more straightforward thing to do. And I think as a junior person, it's much, much more difficult, especially if you've just started a new job, especially if you started a job where you don't know anybody as well. I think that's really tough going. And in my current job, like, we have such a diverse group in our department, and all of those different groups within the wider department come with their own background, and they all face different challenges in feeling like they're able to speak up and talk about these things. So yeah, it's way more difficult. But what I would say is do it. When I'm doing a coffee and cases in my current place, what I say is, let's hash it out. This is a safe room. Let's just talk about stuff that's gone wrong. I try to do what those people did in Sydney for me. I try to lead by example, because I believe strongly that it's the most powerful way of signposting the route to improvement, the route to high performance. Like, where do I turn to get better? I turn to my failures. And I think that if you're able to ingest that into how you think about your job as a junior person, you are going to get to high performance way quicker.
I am thinking on this socialization that you talk about, and I'll give you an example. In my workplace, it can be quite siloed. We can practice for weeks at a time without really having to interact with anyone. There is times where we get together and talk things through, but unfortunately, there seems to be these kind of significant event meetings, where something has gone terribly wrong and we have to root cause and analyze what it is that's gone wrong. There isn't this frequent meeting and optimization and this kind of frequent learning and improving culture. And I'm wondering, firstly, from what you're telling me, it sounds like we're doing it wrong and that we're missing a trick there. I'm wondering, what is it about the socialization that is so important? Is it because you get to know your team much better? Is it because you are just frequently sharing your experiences much more? What is it that's so key about that?
I think there's a few things I would say. The first is you got to think about what kind of knowledge you're sharing when you socialize. So there are two types of knowledge, to kind of get a bit theoretical on you, and that's tacit and explicit. Then explicit knowledge is knowledge that's written down. So the guideline or the standard operating procedure or the manual. Tacit knowledge is really difficult to write down. It's just something that is in your brain, but it's tough to articulate it. And when you socialize, when you're in a relaxed environment talking to your peers, that's when tacit knowledge can bubble up and you can capture it. You can externalize that tacit knowledge. And so, yeah, that's one thing which I think is crucial with socialization, is that it's the type of knowledge. It's like, it's really contemporary, and it's the in-between bit, which is what leads you to high performance. You can read a guideline all day and you're not going to be that good at the job. But if you understand the nuances and you understand where people have gone wrong with that guideline before, and what tweaks they'd have to make to get themselves from A to B, like that does take you to high performance. But yeah, I guess the other thing is it fosters togetherness, it fosters team. And I think that teams exist across healthcare and beyond, like in a GP practice as much as an emergency department. You want to know your team. You want to feel a sense of belonging, and particularly junior people, you've got to try and make them feel that they belong. If a person feels they belong in the team, they will go above and beyond for you. They will do the job to the best of their ability. They will devote a lot of themselves to the job. And that's high performance. That's how you get there.
So, Robert, we've talked about this appreciation of this culture and the culture of learning. But how did you utilize this in your work, and what have you learned from this?
I loved the process so much, which I've detailed, I think, fairly extensively to you guys. I think what I wanted to do over there is I wanted to do something more than just the job. Like I love project work, so I tried to do it as much as I can. And I wanted to do one out in Sydney, and I decided to do it on coffee and cases because I did notice there was a bit of an issue with coffee and cases, believe it or not, and that was that there wasn't a great deal of capture of the knowledge that was being exchanged in these sessions. And so I designed a system which made knowledge capture reasonably sophisticated, tried to kind of capture individual points from the session via a form. I tried to coach people about how best to fill in this form to make sure that learning points were well articulated, and then sort of design this process where there was a bit of post-production of the content that was being captured. So senior people would look through the content. If it was kind of given the thumbs up, it would be disseminated in a variety of ways across the organization. So via a digital newsletter, the Sydney Hems blog, there would be a bit of a summary of what we've been talking about in Coffee and Cases that month. But it did nudge me in an interesting direction, though, and that is this process of collecting data. So trying to mine data from discussion so that data can be disseminated and used by the wider organization. Because if you weren't capturing anything, if you weren't writing anything down on your computer when these discussions were happening, the Coffee and Cases was just in the air. It was just in the room. Only the people that were there could benefit. And I was thinking, these conversations are incredible. Like everybody should be benefiting from them.
Leads us quite nicely on to I think what you mentioned in the latter part of the blog, and that's about actually how you collect this data as we talk about. And really this is alluding to AI. And we were talking before we press record today about how none of us are AI experts here, but I think it's a really interesting topic. Matt and I keep meaning to do an episode on AI in medicine in particular, and the scope of that, the risks of that, and everything that entails, but quite a nice intro to that perhaps here. I know you've dabbled with AI in a lot of GP surgeries, have these ambient scribes where essentially you click a button, you do your consultation, and then it very, very cleverly summarizes the whole consultation for you and kind of misses out all of the unnecessary chit chat or whatever that isn't relevant to the actual case. What was your experience in this? I mean, it's something that I've become quite interested in. I'm reading a book about it, and although reading 84 pages of a book doesn't necessarily make me an expert yet, what's your take on AI here?
First thing to say is I don't know what I'm talking about with AI, really. I just have had this romantic idea that a lot of the data that I have been collecting over the past 3 years, there might be a way of marrying it with a large language model. That is something which is nowhere near my area of expertise, skill set, and it's purely an idea at this point. However, what I would say is that my interest in knowledge as a concept has kind of happened at the same time as the rise of generative AI. I've been using three types of AI, or it's experimented with 3 types of AI at work. So you mentioned ambient scribes. So I've been using Heidi in my day job, which to use an unbelievably cringy overused term, but it truly is applicable. Like, it's a game changer, this idea of not having to type your notes during or after you see a patient. You can just focus on talking to them. You can just focus on the human element of a consultation. It's just, to me, is just an incredibly freeing and transformative experience. So I use an ambient scribe. I've been playing with this app called PM Cardio, which is an AI that is able to interpret ECGs. Now, this is a bit techie and medical, but I don't think it's that useful for emergency medicine doctors. I think what it is useful for is triage streaming front door ECGs to try and work out whether somebody's got something worrying that needs to be escalated quickly or not. I think it would also be really useful in the pre-hospital environment with paramedics, which patients need to go to a heart attack center, which don't. So I think huge utility there, and it's been really interesting to play with that. And then there's also this fantastic app called Olus Medical, which I do mention in the blog actually. And they have they're a sort of knowledge management app, and they are trying to put together a large language model, or a sort of a small large language model type thing, which can ingest lots of guidelines and other useful documents with important information. And then you can ask questions and it gives you answers in the way that ChatGPT does, but instead of the internet, it uses trusted guidelines. So yeah, I've been playing with those technologies at the same time as doing a lot of this work. So it's an exciting time. Things are changing, and I think that our profession is going to look very different. Do I see it as an existential threat? No, I do not. I see it as an opportunity for us to be more human, and I'm excited by that prospect.
Yeah, I actually agree with you on that point. I think there's a lot of talk about AI replacement jobs or AI augmentation jobs, and I see medicine in particular is very much in the latter camp. I mean, I think interestingly, it's slightly terrifying to think about this. But I think I was reading in this book, which I will give a plug to because it's very good. It's called Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mollick, and talks about how the stage we're at the moment is probably equivalent to your Pac-Man at an arcade, but we will get to the PlayStation 6 level of AI in terms of we're very much at the foothills of what AI can do, and it's slightly terrifying to think what our jobs and what many people's jobs will look like. I mean, look, we could talk for absolutely hours about AI. To be clear, it would be hours of complete drivel because, as we said, none of us are experts here. But I think an interesting addition, I think, to the culture and the performance that you focused on and spoken about so eloquently today.
Yeah, I think that like what I see AI doing for performance is that it gives you access. I think there is a gap between what we know in an organization and what we do in practice. I think that applies to most healthcare organizations. If you look at most healthcare organizations, whether it's an emergency department, general practice, or a cardiology unit, what you'll have is a load of clinicians and a load of computers and whatever operational equipment that you need, and an area in hospital. And if you look in the computers, you'll have some really disorganized Microsoft Teams folders with lots of documents. Some are out of date, poorly labeled, sort of haphazard PDFs, very difficult to search. A lot of people in the organization won't have access to those files. They won't have up-to-date logins, or there'll be new starters. I mean, you know what it's like. Everywhere you go is an IT nightmare. What that means in real life is that when a doctor is or a nurse is making decisions about a patient, they often don't have the information, the knowledge at their fingertips. They don't have it. I think that happens all the time. I think it happens every day on repeat in every department across the NHS, which obviously might sound scary to some people, but it just is the case. And I think AI is the answer to that. I think that large language models can synthesize vast quantities of information, put it all together, make you a bespoke answer, and there you have it. Do I think ChatGPT is the answer? Absolutely not. I think that ChatGPT looks at the entire internet. And I think on my short journey through AI, when you look at what a large language model actually is, it's just data. It's just pattern recognition. It's looking through lots and like unfathomable volumes of text data, and then just predicting what the next letter is, what the next word is. And so if you ask a question of ChatGPT, it can often get it wrong because it's just predicted the wrong next bit. And so when you apply that to clinical practice, it's very frightening. You don't want the wrong answer when you're trying to make a decision about a patient's differential diagnosis. So yeah, I think that it's very exciting. I think it is the answer to a massive problem in our world, but we got to be very careful about it.
Just to take the flip side and maybe be the Luddite who is refusing to adopt new technology, because you two both sound very positive and effusive with praise towards how AI is going to revolutionise and make everyone's work and performance better. I want to know your opinions on when does this become a limitation? When do we become so reliant on this technology that it actually starts inadvertently hindering our human critical thinking. A great example of this that's, I guess, easy to understand is my dad will always get out a map and will always say, did you come on the the A1 or the M1 or the B127AZ or whatever? And I just look at him like, I have absolutely no idea. I have no idea which road I came on. I followed a blue arrow on my phone, and I simply do not care for this conversation. Which actually sounds a bit harsh. But there's a generational gap between those who still think about which road they've gone on and curious as to which road you chose to take, versus a new generation who are using a technology which always knows the fastest way, or usually knows the fastest way to go. And I'm always getting to the end point faster than my dad, probably, but I don't know the roads like my father does. And I think that's an example of how this adoption wholeheartedly and this reliance on technology might actually create a generation who just don't have any knowledge. They don't have the skills, or they don't have the knowledge base that they need. What are your thoughts on this point?
Yeah, I agree with that. I listened to Simon Sinek talk on what's the something CEO podcast. I can't remember, but yeah, Simon Sinek.
Don't mention it.
Sorry, yeah,
You can't plug other podcasts on here.
Sorry, I know it's incredibly rude,
especially not direct rivals.
Absolutely, in many ways, two heavyweights that I can't pick between. But I did listen to Simon Sinek. Do you guys know Simon Sinek?
Yeah, he's coming on next week.
Is he your next guest? But yeah, he basically kind of said in a much more eloquent way than you just did, Matt, the same message, and that is that AI is the answer, but humanity is the journey, like to that answer. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's the process of learning and making mistakes and eventually finding yourself at the destination.
He obviously wasn't going to have any other view than that with a name like that, to be fair.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what you've said, Matt, is true. And I do think that that's potentially problematic. I think that we have to be willing to let go of some stuff. There's a lot of stuff that we do that we just don't need to do. Like, I mean, for example, something that I think about when I use this app, this ECG app, I've spent years of my career just loving the intellectual sort of process of learning ECGs and subtle ECG changes that I pick up on. I feel a huge amount of professional satisfaction when I do so. But the reality is, like, the machine's going to be better than me. It probably already is. In fact, it certainly already is, because it's looking at trillions of ECGs, and I'm only looking at a handful, really, every day. And I think that, that's that kind of thing we have to be willing to depart from, because there are other things to focus on. And I think that one thing that AI will do, this is again going very optimistic, and that is that it allows us to focus on stuff I think that really we can only do, and that is look at our patients in the eye, be sensitive, have a bedside manner that makes them feel able to talk freely about their problems, and leading teams effectively, making your team feel that they belong. These kind of really human elements that I think that we'll just never be able. They're things that are intrinsically human, and we must lean into those. If there's any medical students listening, don't worry about learning the cause of AF. Learn how to be a good leader. The world is changing, and we just need to embrace it, because it's not gonna not happen.
That's my view on this. The genie's out of the bottle. We ain't going back to a time where AI isn't a thing. And I think we just got to roll with it and try and optimize what we do with AI in collaboration. There's so much other stuff that we could be doing that actually, if a machine can do it better and do it faster, and it's going to allow us time to do something else, then I think we have to embrace it.
So we've talked about AI and how this is going to optimize things in the future. You mentioned earlier this search for betterment through the socialization of knowledge. And I guess one risk of AI is that it detracts from the socialization potentially. If we don't then need to learn, we can just sit down with the machine and we know everything by having this interface with a machine. How do we need to promote this culture that you talked about, and how do we need to step away or make sure that we don't step too far in that direction?
Well, I think it will happen naturally, because I think that people crave it. I think people want to be talking to their colleagues and their friends and their family. I don't think there will be a world where we're all locked on with VR headsets on and just typing. I don't think that that's a future that anybody would want to inhabit. And so I think naturally there will be safeguards against an overly digitized world just by virtue of the fact that human beings exist and we're social creatures. And I think that that's a big part of Coffee and Cases. Like, it just felt right, felt natural, and it felt messy. And those things all sort of fit together in my soul, as they do in everybody's soul, really. And I am not concerned that AI will replace socialization. I just think that it's part of who we are. And I think that a priority of every organization is to try and ensure that that is prioritized, that time is prioritized, the time that human beings are sat in a room talking to each other, because it will improve the performance of the organization.
I think a really nice place to round it up. Robbie, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that everybody who's listening finds that as interesting as we have. Where can our listeners find out a little bit more about you or hear more from you?
Yeah, check out my Substack. So I write a blog, which I've actually been writing since 2014. So you can track back all the way through my how I documented my time in South Africa on there. You can find it at robertloyd.substack.com. And yeah, do feel free to check out what's on there and maybe even give me a follow.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Robbie.
No worries, guys. Thanks a lot for having me. That was awesome.